On May 9, 1863, James Longstreet arrived near the winter quarters of the Army of Northern Virginia and its leader, Robert E. Lee. The two men discussed the events that transpired during the Battle of Chancellorsville and Jackson's wounding. Lee was obviously concerned about his wounded corps commander. The next day, a little after 3 p.m., Jackson would pass away. Without the commander of the 2nd Corps, Lee now turned solely to Longstreet to discuss the upcoming campaign. Longstreet, after the war, devoted numerous pages describing the meetings he had with Lee from May 11th to the 13th. It was during those meetings that they constructed what would become known as the Gettysburg campaign. During those meetings, Longstreet proposed again to send 2 divisions of his corps and himself to Tennessee, combine that force with the Army of Tennessee and Joseph E. Johnston's troops, overpower the Army of the Cumberland near Nashville, then invade Kentucky and threaten Cincinnati. Longstreet believed that was the only way to stop the capitulation of Vicksburg. When Lee suggested an invasion into Pennsylvania, Longstreet believed the campaign would take too long and Vicksburg would fall before it concluded. Longstreet would say later that it became useless and improper to offer suggestions leading to a different course. All that I could ask was that the policy of the campaign should be one of defensive tactics, that we should work so as to force the enemy to attack us in such a good position as we might find in his own country, so well adapted to that purpose which might assure us of a grand triumph. To this he readily assented as an important and material adjunct to his general plan. Despite his caveats to Lee's plan, a contemporary letter written to Senator Wigfall reveals Longstreet's confidence in an invasion of Pennsylvania. He said, "If we could cross the Potomac with 150,000 men, I think we could demand Lincoln to declare his purpose. If it is a Christian purpose, enough of blood has been shed to satisfy any principles. If he intends extermination, we should know it at once and play a little at that game whilst we can." Longstreet saw the value in taking the war into the North, and these statements reveal that he was not as Western-centric as his later writings may have alluded. Lee would travel to Richmond to meet with President Davis and the cabinet members and remain there from May 14th to the 18th. The cabinet voted in favor of the invasion. Before the Army of Northern Virginia marched off for Pennsylvania, Lee reorganized the army. He had thought hard about it even before Jackson's death, but now, with the general's death, it was the perfect time. He would replace Jackson with Richard Ewell and create another corps, the 3rd Corps, and give it to A.P. Hill. Furthermore, Lee took divisions from the 1st and 2nd Corps to create the 3rd. Longstreet's reorganized corps would be composed of the divisions of Lafayette McLaws, John Bell Hood, and George Pickett. Longstreet agreed with the placement of Richard Ewell to corps commander, but thought less of A.P. Hill, who he saw as inferior to Ewell. Longstreet preferred placing D.H. Hill in command of the 3rd Corps. Lee had grown disappointed in Lafayette McLaws's generalship. Illness made his performance at Chancellorsville lackluster, and the army commander asked Longstreet to inquire of his division commander's health and see if he would be open to other service. McLaws said his health was fine and resisted reassignment, even after Longstreet offered to send him further south and possibly switch the division commander with Beauregard, who would come to Northern Virginia with a corps to help during the summer. Nevertheless, McLaws stayed. However, because he stayed, Lee made it clear to Longstreet that any mistake McLaws made during the campaign, that Longstreet would be held responsible. Longstreet affirmed that he understood and promised to give personal attention to the division and its commander. This shift in relationship between Longstreet and McLaws would be the start of a rift between the two men. On June 3rd, the Army of Northern Virginia began marching north. Before the campaign, Lee would write about his army that the country cannot overestimate its worth. There never were such men in any army before and never can be again. If properly led, they will go anywhere and never fail at the work before them. The march was quick and brutal in the summer heat. Longstreet crossed and recrossed the Shenandoah River to support Stuart's cavalry as they guarded the gaps in the Blue Ridge, providing a screening movement for the army. As Longstreet surveyed his troops, an officer said that the general must be tired. Longstreet responded, "No, I have never felt fatigue in my life." As the army marched north, Lee accompanied Longstreet. They stayed close, with Lee seeking the general's advice through every phase of the campaign. By June 27th, part of the army had made it to Chambersburg. The town flooded with soldiers, and Longstreet and Lee made their headquarters in a grove of trees outside the town known as Shatter's Woods. On the march, a British observer named Arthur Freemantle part of the Coldstream Guards, attached himself to Longstreet's staff. He wrote of Lee and Longstreet, "The relations between him and Longstreet are quite touching. They are almost always together. Longstreet's corps complain of this sometimes, as they say that they seldom get a chance of detached service, which falls to the lot of Ewell. It is impossible to please Longstreet more than by praising Lee. I believe these two generals to be as little ambitious and as thoroughly unselfish as any men in the world." On June 28th, with the absence of Jeb Stuart's cavalry, Lee and Longstreet got their first piece of solid intelligence about the Union Army. Harrison the Scout, paid in gold coins at the beginning of the month by Longstreet, had found Longstreet's headquarters and reported that the Union Army was on the move through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. Upon hearing the news, Lee recalled Ewell from Carlisle in order to concentrate his forces. On the 30th, Lee and Longstreet moved eastward toward Cashtown, and they set up their headquarters near a deserted sawmill. Lee made the statement earlier in the day that, "Tomorrow, gentlemen, we will not move to Harrisburg as we expected, but will go over to Gettysburg and see what General Meade is after." On July 1st, the two armies engaged at the little town of Gettysburg. Longstreet, Lee, and Fremantle advanced along the Chambersburg Pike, and as they rode along, men from Edward Johnson's division of Ewell's corps, who had never seen Longstreet, got close to the general. When some Floridians saw Longstreet, they cried out, "Look out for work now, boys, for here's the old bulldog again." As the generals got closer to the battle, Longstreet observed the Federals regrouping on high ground beyond the town. He commented to Lee that, "We could not call the enemy to position better suited to our plans. All that we have to do is file around his left and secure good ground between him and his capital." Lee did not like that idea and jabbed his fist into his hand, saying, "If the enemy is there tomorrow, we must attack him." Longstreet responded, "If he is there, it will be because he is anxious that we should attack him, a good reason, in my judgment, for not doing so." Longstreet's proposal to move between the Union Army and the capital was impracticable at that moment. Lee did not know where the Union Army was. In fact, many of the corps were on their way to Gettysburg, which means a movement in that direction would put them in collision with the rest of the Union Army. For that moment, Lee's directive for an attack the next day was the better course of action. Longstreet bedded down beside the road where his divisions rested. One could only imagine he got little sleep as he dreaded an attack the next day. Before the sun rose on July 2, 1863, James Longstreet, after just a few hours of sleep, rode to Seminary Ridge to meet with Robert E. Lee. Lee himself had awakened early, ate breakfast, and began preparations for the day. When the two met, Lee notified Longstreet that he intended to continue the offensive. Longstreet objected and suggested they swing past the Union left flank and place themselves between Washington and the Union Army. Lee rejected the proposal, then summoned Captain Samuel Johnston, an engineer from his staff, to reconnoiter the Federal position. He would be accompanied by an engineer under Longstreet, Major John Clark. After they went on their way, Lee, Longstreet, A.P. Hill, Henry Heath, and John Bell Hood met north of the seminary buildings that gave Seminary Ridge its name. 3 hours later, Johnston and Clark found Lee, A.P. Hill, and Longstreet discussing the possibilities for the day. The two engineers had rode southeast to the Peach Orchard, across the Emmitsburg Road, and along the base of two hills, called Big Round Top and Little Round Top. Aside from 4 Federal cavalrymen, the engineers found no enemy troops. Lee, excited and inquisitive, pointed to the two hills and asked, "Did you get there?" Johnston answered in the affirmative. The three generals met for a few moments, then Longstreet and Hill walked away. Lee told Johnston to join Longstreet. Johnston believed that meant for him to aid him in any way that he could. The information Johnston gave Lee was inaccurate, though. Union infantry of the 3rd Corps occupied the ground to the north of the two hills, and although mist could have obscured the view of the staff member, he should have been able to hear the men and animals not too far away. This would have serious implications for the day's fighting. Lafayette McLaws arrived to meet with Lee and Longstreet. Although most agree that he arrived after Johnston had returned with the information, McLaws argued that he arrived before the staffer returned. If he had arrived before, then Lee would not have had the information claimed in the account, but this is how McLaws remembered it. According to McLaws, Lee pointed to a map he was holding and drew a perpendicular line across the Emmitsburg Road, saying, "General, I wish you to place your division across this road, and I wish you to get there, if possible, without being seen by the enemy. Can you get there?" McLaws responded, "I know of nothing to prevent me." then asked permission to reconnoiter the ground. Lee informed him that Johnston was already doing it, so McLaws requested permission to join Johnston. Longstreet, who was pacing not too far away and listening to the conversation, came over and exclaimed, "No, sir, I do not wish you to leave your division." Longstreet then pointed to the map and drew a parallel line to the Emmitsburg Road, not a perpendicular line as Lee had done. Longstreet then said, "I wish your division placed so." Lee then interrupted, saying, "No, General, I wish it placed just perpendicular to that." Again, McLaws requested to reconnoiter the ground, and again Longstreet denied him. With that, McLaws rode back to his division to get them in place. Lee then rode to meet with General Ewell on the left flank. By 11 o'clock, he was back on Seminary Ridge, where Longstreet got his orders to advance the divisions of McLaws and Hood. Evander Law's brigade of Hood's division was going to be late, so he requested a delay to wait for the brigade. Lee agreed, and then rode off. Even some of Longstreet's supporters, like Edward Porter Alexander and his aide Moxley Sorrell, saw that Longstreet did not go about his work with the vigor with which he performed previous military duties assigned to him by Lee. According to one of his biographers, he may have let his disagreement with Lee influence his performance. What was lacking in Longstreet was the energetic and careful preparation that had been a hallmark of his generalship at 2nd Manassas, Sharpsburg, and Fredericksburg. The failings on this day, however, were not solely Longstreet's. Like an ungainly beast, the Confederate Army stumbled into battle on July 2nd. McLaws's division led Longstreet's corps, with McLaws and Johnston in the lead. Longstreet rode in front of Hood's division. As the lead division was about to crest a hill, McLaws and Johnston realized that Little Round Top could be seen and the signal station there would pick up their movement. When the column of troops stopped, Longstreet rode to see what was the matter. After explaining the situation to his corps commander, McLaws commented that they would have to countermarch to get to another route, so Longstreet told them to countermarch. Johnston claimed that he recommended to avoid the hill by going through a field like the artillery had done, but Longstreet preferred to use the road. It was around 3 p.m. before the first of McLaws' troops made it to the field, but when artillery opened up on his lead brigade under Joseph Kershaw, McLaws realized that Longstreet had been wrong when he told him that he would be on the flank, that no enemy troops would be opposite him. McLaws wanted to attack, but Longstreet held off until Hood could deploy his troops. Hood sent scouts to his front and determined that he could swing around to the right and flank the Union position. Longstreet denied the request no less than 4 times, then rode to Hood personally to order him to attack, then rode back to observe the assaults. In the words of a Texan, he sat astride his horse like an iron man, with his spyglass to his eye, coolly watching the effect of our shots. Limbs of trees fell and crashed around him, yet he sat as unmoved as a statue. The attack began at around 4 p.m. Hood's men attacked Devil's Den, the Valley of Death, the Wheat Field, and the Round Tops, while McLaws' troops attacked the Wheat Field and the Peach Orchard. Behind the Mississippians of William Barksdale and their successful charge came the Georgians of William Wofford. Ahead of the men from Georgia was Longstreet himself. When the brigade saw him, they cheered. Longstreet shouted, "Cheer less, men, and fight more." The Georgians passed a group of prisoners captured by the Mississippians. One of the Federals asked who the general was. When the man found out it was Longstreet, he stated, "No wonder we are thrashed upon every field. There is not in the whole of our army a lieutenant general who would have risked his life in such a charge." Longstreet remained at the Peach Orchard watching the attacks take place. Not since his time at the Piper Farm at Antietam did he get so close to the fighting. One of his biographers claimed that it may be because he promised Lee that he would take personal responsibility for McLaws' performance. While watching Hood and more closely McLaws' division, General Pickett approached. He and his men had come from Chambersburg, and he had rode ahead to receive his orders. After watching the battle with his friend, Pickett then went back to his division, finding out that Lee did not need him that day, that he would be sent for when ready. Longstreet called off the assaults when it got dark, but did not report personally to Lee. Instead, he sent an aide to relay a summary of the day's actions. One of Longstreet's biographers explained the situation well when he wrote, "His decision not to confer with Lee was probably due more to his mood than to the necessity for a short horseback ride. He had watched his 2 divisions fight magnificently only to suffer heavy losses in an attack he never wanted. He had been unable to conceal his anger with Lee's plan, and after the sacrifice he had witnessed, his dissatisfaction could only have been worse that night." Lee issued orders that the offensive would be continued at daylight the next day. Longstreet would claim that he never received the order, and neither he nor Lee informed Pickett of his role. Although he claimed to have not received the order, Edward Porter Alexander's version of events described him going to Longstreet's headquarters and the Corps commander informing him that they would renew the attack at daylight. Nevertheless, Longstreet went to bed that night angry at the horrendous loss of life that day, despite his objections to the plan. Robert E. Lee rode to the Confederate right to find Longstreet at sunrise. When he found Longstreet, the 1st Corps commander explained to him that, "General, I have had my scouts out all night, and I find that you still have an excellent opportunity to move around to the right of Meade's army and maneuver him into attacking us." After listening to Longstreet explain, Lee waved off such a maneuver and pointed towards Cemetery Ridge and said he would attack that position with the 3 divisions of the 1st Corps. Longstreet responded, "General, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know, as well as anyone, what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arranged for battle can take that position." The two men discussed it a little further, but Longstreet realized that Lee would not budge on his decision. Lee then jabbed his fist towards Cemetery Ridge and declared, "The enemy is there, and I am going to strike him." The two men then rode off close to the Emmitsburg Road and observed the Federal position. Soon they were joined by A.P. Hill and Henry Heath. Longstreet explained that Hood and McLaws' divisions were too badly hurt from the previous day to be used in a main assault on this day, and it was decided that Pickett's fresh division and brigades from Hill's Corps would be used to spearhead and support the attack. A large artillery bombardment would take place before the infantry attack to soften up the Federal position and neutralize the Federal artillery. Preparations began to form up the infantry for their assault on Cemetery Ridge. Pickett's division would be in 2 lines, 2 brigades in front and 1 in back. The brigades from Hill's Corps on Pickett's left were still suffering from their devastating fight on the first day, and Longstreet would say that sending them into battle on the 3rd day was a grievous error. Nevertheless, Lee assigned Longstreet to the role of commander of the attack, even over the troops of A.P. Hill. Hill even said in his report that he ordered his brigades to report to Longstreet, but Longstreet did not position those troops. They were left to themselves, it seems. Hill, presumably not wanting to step on Longstreet's toes when that general was given command of the attack, did not position them either. All of the preparations were completed between 11 a.m. and noon. At 11:45 a.m., Longstreet sent a message to Porter Alexander, the commander of his artillery, saying, "If the artillery fire does not have the effort to drive off the enemy or greatly demoralize him, so as to make our effort pretty certain, I would prefer that you should not advise General Pickett to make the charge. I shall rely a great deal upon your judgment to determine the matter, and shall expect you to let General Pickett know when the moment offers." Longstreet was evidently attempting to shift responsibility to Alexander. The artilleryman became concerned over the note and asked Brigadier General Ambrose Wright, who was meeting with him when the note arrived, about it. Then Alexander wrote back to Longstreet, "General, I will only be able to judge the effect of our fire on the enemy by his return fire, as his infantry is but little exposed to view, and the smoke will obscure the whole field. If, as I infer from your note, there is any alternative to this attack, it would be carefully considered before opening our fire, for it will take all the artillery ammunition we have left to test this one thoroughly, and if the result is unfavorable, we will have none left for another effort, and even if this is entirely successful, it can only be so at a very bloody cost." At 12:15, Longstreet responded, "The intention is to advance the infantry. If the artillery has the desired effect of driving the enemy off, or having other effects such as to warrant us in making the attack." Alexander rode to Pickett to confer with the Virginian, and finding Pickett in good spirits about the attack, he wrote back to Longstreet, "When our artillery fire is at its best, I will advise General Pickett to advance." At around 1 p.m., over 150 cannons opened up on the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. Amid the hail of iron and explosions, the Confederate troops organized for the attack waited anxiously. Brigadier General James Kemper of Pickett's division remembered, "While this was going on, Longstreet rode slowly and alone immediately in front of our entire line. He sat his large charger with a magnificent grace and composure I never before beheld. His bearing was to me the grandest moral spectacle of the war. I expected to see him fall every instant. Still he moved on, slowly and majestically. with an inspiriting confidence, composure, self-possession, and repressed power in every movement and look that fascinated me. As Longstreet approached, Kemper walked toward him and said, "General, this is a terrible place." "What, is your command suffering?" asked Longstreet. "Yes, a man is cut to pieces here every second while we are talking. Sometimes a dozen are killed at one shot." Longstreet responded, "Is it possible? Can't you find any safer position for your men?" "No, we are exactly behind the line of this crest, the very safest place about here." "I am greatly distressed at this," Longstreet replied. "Greatly distressed at this, but let us hold our ground a while longer. We are hurting the enemy badly, and will charge them presently." Alexander observed during the cannonade that the Union guns were not stopping or becoming neutralized like he had hoped. Then he thought he saw a number of guns being dragged away. He wrote a quick note to Pickett. "The 18 guns have been driven off. For God's sake, come on quick, or we cannot support you. Ammunition nearly out." The courier carrying that message found Pickett and Longstreet together. The corps commander looked grim as Pickett read the message. Pickett asked, "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet could not speak. He turned his face away and nodded. Pickett saluted, mounted his horse, and said, "I shall lead my division forward, sir." Longstreet then rode to Alexander and inquired about the artillery. Alexander stated to Longstreet that his ammunition chests were empty, and he would have trouble supporting the infantry. Longstreet wanted to halt Pickett's division until the ammunition could be replenished, but Alexander explained it would take over an hour to get all of that accomplished, and the Union forces would only fortify their position more in that time. Longstreet told Alexander, "I don't want to make this attack. I believe it will fail. I do not see how it can succeed. I would not make it even now, but that General Lee has ordered it and expects it." Pickett's men began their march, and Longstreet sat on a rail fence, watching his veteran troops march into the jaws of death. Longstreet sent staffers to urge the support on Pickett's right and left forward. In the late stages of the attack, the British soldier Arthur Fremantle found Longstreet, saying he wouldn't have missed this for anything. Longstreet responded, "The devil you wouldn't. I would have liked to have missed it very much. We've attacked and been repulsed. Look there." The divisions and brigades that took part in the assault began streaming back to Seminary Ridge after being defeated. Longstreet and Lee rode along the lines and encouraged the men and attempted to raise their spirits. The two generals conferred with one another and decided to order a retreat. By the middle of the month, the Army of Northern Virginia was back in Virginia.